Hey everybody, it's me, Steve SCHNEE, the CD Junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I'm going to be discussing a power pop supergroup by the name of The Nerves. Now this trio, they are definitely a real bona fide supergroup, but they sort of work the opposite way of most supergroups. You know, if you think of a band like Asia or whoever, those kinds of bands are supergroups that are comprised of members of other bands. But The Nerves was actually the first band for these three gentlemen, and then they went off and became legends in the power pop community. In fact, The Nerves were sort of pioneers, founders of that power pop scene that we love so much that came from the late 70s. Now, the band consists of guitarist Jack Lee, bassist Peter Case, and drummer Paul Collins. The group existed only for a short time, but they released a 4-track EP in 1976. One of the tracks on this EP was a song written by Jack Lee, and it was called Hanging on the Telephone, which we'll get to in just a moment. But let me show you here. This is actually a CD that came out in, I think, 2008, and it features that EP plus some previously unreleased studio and demo tracks and some live recordings. And that's all there. The CD is called One Way Ticket. So if you're trying to get a hold of songs from that very first Nerves EP, all 4 of them appear here. I mentioned just a moment ago that Jack Lee wrote a song called Hanging on the Telephone. Well, they gave a copy of the EP to, I think, like Blondie's manager, and they were basically rebuffed and said, whatever, and sent along their way. But then, of course, in 1978, out comes Parallel Lines featuring the song Hanging on the Telephone, and that song became one of Blondie's biggest hits and is still cited as one of their finest songs. The song was actually written by Jack Lee of The Nerves, as I previously said. And just because this is CD Junkie, I have another version of Parallel Lines there. This is the deluxe version. Anyway, so Jack Lee left The Nerves, and Paul Collins and Peter Case continued as a band called The Breakaways, but that was only like some sessions, and they didn't last very long. Now, the first Nerves member to release something was Paul Collins, and that was, of course, his band, The Beat, and this is one of the greatest power pop albums of all time. And this is just the little mini sleeve version. You can find this in just a regular jewel case version as well. That came out in 1979. They legally had to change their name because there was a British band called The Beat, so they changed their name to Paul Collins Beat, where the British band changed their name to the English Beat. So this album, The Kids Are the Same, came out in 1981. Followed by 2 EPs. There was the To Beat or Not to Beat in 1983, and the Long Time Gone EP in 1985. Both of those are on one CD. Now, essentially, that version of The Beat broke up, and Paul Collins continued to release albums. I don't have all of them on CD, but I will show you what I have. This is the Paul Collins Band, and this is called From Town to Town. This came out in 1993. Then he came back with the name Paul Collins Beat for Flying High, and that came out in 2005. That is followed by Paul Collins Beat, Ribbons of Gold. That came out in 2008. King of Power Pop came out in 2010. Feel the Noise, here I'll show you that way, came out in 2014. And Out of My Head came out in 2018. All of these albums are fantastic, just great melodies. It just seems that Paul Collins can just knock off melodies in his sleep. Just still continues to be a great songwriter. Don't discount these albums and think that they're going to be mediocre, because they're not. They're great. Now, that's it with Paul Collins. Now, in 1980, the Plimsouls released an EP called 0 Hour. And I heard the song Great Big World on Rodney on the Rock, and it blew me away, so I rushed out and found a local store that was carrying independent releases at that time and picked that EP up, and that blew me away. It was only like 5 songs, but it was still fantastic. So in 1981, out comes the album The Plimsouls. Now, of course, it doesn't have the plus there, but this is another great album. But the difference between Peter Case, Paul Collins, Jack Lee is Peter Case had more of a soulful R&B feel to his music. I mean, he had that gruff, soulful voice. So I don't believe that the Plimsouls are pure power pop, but when they are power pop, oh my, like the song Now, which is off of the self-titled album, is one of my favorite singles of all time, one of the greatest examples of power pop. Now, this CD here came out on Rhino. It's not out of print, but it includes the first album and the 0 Hour EP, as well as a few bonus tracks, including an instrumental version of the Nerves track, When You Find Out, plus some live B-sides and stuff, but it's really fantastic. The Plimsouls, but sales weren't that good, so the band was dropped. And in 1982, they released on their own label, I think it was Shaky City, they released a 2-track single, Million Miles Away on one side and I'll Get Lucky on the other side. And that thing just started getting airplay at the yin yang on Orange County and LA stations. And of course, it landed them a deal, and they got signed to Geffen, and they released Everywhere at Once in 1983. Now, this, of course, has both Million Miles Away and I'll Get Lucky, but it's also got Oldest Story in the World and lots of great stuff. Again, this is less power pop than the first album, explores different avenues, still a great, fantastic record. I mean, the Plimsouls didn't put out a bad record, and I love them to death. And of course, after this, they split up. Peter Case went off to a very successful career that was more folk, roots rock. He wasn't really sticking to the power pop thing, and there was still, more soul. And he went off in a different direction. But in 1997, reunited with 3 of the original members, plus drummer Clem Burke. So this has the drummer from Blondie on it, and Blondie is the band that covered, of course, Hanging on the Telephone. So this sort of brings Peter Case past up to his present, at least in 1997. So that's a great little record. Of course, Clem Burke's one of the greatest drummers ever. But this does have Dave Pahoa on bass and Eddie Munoz on guitar. But this is the only album they put out. There are plenty of Plimsouls live releases out there, legitimate ones, and it covers their heyday in the early 80s. So you can track those down. I'm focusing on the studio releases here. But what about Jack Lee, who wrote Hanging on the Telephone? Well, Jack Lee in 1981 released an album called Jack Lee's Greatest Hits. And that, of course, featured Hanging on the Telephone and mostly unreleased tracks. One of the tracks on Greatest Hits Volume 1 was called Come Back and Stay. And that was actually later covered by British blue-eyed soul vocalist Paul Young for his debut album. That was actually his biggest American hit. So that's kind of interesting. And also, Jack Lee put out another album in 1985. It was just self-titled. And I didn't even know of this album's existence. I think it only came out in France. I didn't know about this album for about 20 years. The album is very different, but it's also very poppy too. It's very 1985 in terms of, there's a couple songs there with some synths, and there's a couple songs there that sound like maybe they were trying to go for a commercial sound. But there's a lot of great melodies on the album, and it is worth tracking down. But you don't have to work hard because it's available on CD. This is called Bigger Than Life, and this features both albums on one disc. So you're going to get Jack Lee's Greatest Hits from 1981 and Jack Lee from 1985. And they are both available here. And that's a really fun release. In fact, you should definitely check this out. You should check all this stuff out because it's just great pop. Whether you like power pop, if you like rock and roll with great hooks, then you're going to love the Nerves, the Plimsouls, the Beat, Jack Lee, and the Breakaways. And that's about it. I appreciate you hanging out and listening to me jibber jabber about the Nerves, and I'd really appreciate it if you would like, share, comment, subscribe, maybe hit that bell to be notified of future videos. But until the next time, remember me, Steve SCHNEE, the CD Junkie.